3 letters. That's what the Japanese naval attaché sent back to Tokyo after the fighting over Buna in the last days of December 1942. 3 short cables warning that something new had appeared in the sky above New Guinea, something the Zero could not catch and could not shake. Nobody in Tokyo wanted to believe it. They filed the reports, argued about them, and set them aside. By the time they took the warning seriously, more than a year later, the finest naval aviators Japan had ever produced were dead in the jungle or drowned off the reefs, and the sky belonged to somebody else. This is the story of how that happened. Not the tidy version that circulates online, where a single wonder plane wins the Pacific by itself. The real one. The one that begins with a farm boy from Wisconsin who talked his way into a fight he wasn't supposed to be in, and ends with the 2 highest-scoring American aces of the war, both dead within months of each other, one in a jet over California, one in a jungle turn he had spent years warning other pilots never to take. The farm boy's name was Richard Bong. He was 22 years old on the morning of December 27, 1942, and he was flying a fighter he did not officially own, with a squadron that was not officially his, over a beachhead that most Americans back home could not have found on a map. Below him, in loose formation, were Japanese fighters and dive bombers of the same type that had ruled this ocean since Pearl Harbor. Bong pushed his nose down into a dive his instructors had told him never to attempt, came through the enemy formation faster than they could turn, and pulled back up into empty sky with 2 kills painted on the side of an aircraft he was still learning to fly. He did not know it that morning, but he had just opened the highest-scoring combat career in American aviation history. He also did not know that the machine under him had just done the one thing the Japanese air staff believed impossible. Both facts would take a while to sink in. To understand what happened over Buna that morning, you have to understand how completely the Zero had ruled the sky before it. For 13 months, from Pearl Harbor forward, the Mitsubishi A6M, the fighter Allied pilots, simply called the Zero, had been the finest close-in dogfighter in the world. It could outturn anything the Americans flew. It could climb like something startled off a branch. It was flown by veterans who had learned their trade over China before the war ever reached Hawaii. And they had carried that experience across half the world, from the Philippines to Malaya to the coast of Australia. Allied airmen came to talk about the Zero the way sailors used to talk about certain reefs. A thing that killed you if you approached it wrong, and there was no right way to approach it. The reputation was not entirely earned, but in 1942, almost nobody on the Allied side was in a position to prove that. American pilots in their P-39s and P-40s had learned the price of trying. They had gone into turning fights with the Zero, and they had died in them, one after another, until the lesson was written in the loss of a whole generation of friends. Turn with a Zero and a Zero will settle onto your tail and kill you. There seemed to be no answer at all except luck and weight of numbers. The result was a defeat that ran deeper than any single battle. Allied pilots went up expecting to lose. Expecting to lose bred caution, and caution was its own handicap. As long as the fight belonged to the Zero, no amount of courage could fix the problem, because courage flown into a turning fight against a better turning aircraft simply produced brave dead men. A few men had already begun to work out the way past it. In China, an American named Claire Chennault had told his volunteer pilots never to dogfight the Japanese at all, dive on them from above, fire once, dive away, trade agility for speed and height. It was the beginning of the idea. But Chennault's men were flying P-40s, and a P-40 could dive well enough but could not climb back to altitude quickly. They could strike once, and then they had to run. The Navy reached toward the same truth by a different road. Its pilots worked out a weaving pattern flown by pairs of fighters, each covering the other, that let even a slower American aircraft survive against the Zero by never leaving a wingman alone. Different tactic, same underlying lesson. The Zero could not be beaten by matching it turn for turn. It had to be beaten by tactics, by teamwork, and above all by a machine that fought on terms the Zero could not answer. If stories like this interest you, the ones where the real history is far more human and far more strange than the version we grew up with, I dig into a new one every week on this channel. Subscribe if that sounds worth your time. The machine that would answer the Zero was already flying by then. It had been born on a drawing board in Burbank, California, years before Pearl Harbor, under a young engineer named Clarence Johnson. Everyone in the aviation industry would eventually know him simply as Kelly. What Kelly Johnson drew looked like nothing else in the sky. 2 engines instead of 1, 2 long tail booms running back from those engines, and the pilot seated in a small central pod between them, high enough to see in every direction. The Army had asked in 1937 for a high-altitude interceptor faster than anything then flying, and Johnson had answered by breaking every rule in the fighter book. He put 2 engines in a machine that was supposed to be a single-seat pursuit. He split the airframe to carry them and their turbo superchargers. He gave the whole thing a top speed no one had ever quite seen in a fighter before. The prototype crossed the United States in a matter of hours in 1939. Whatever else it was fast. Over the vast distances of the Pacific, 2 engines meant something beyond speed. A pilot who lost 1 over 500 miles of ocean could still come home on the other, and a great many of them did exactly that. That strange shape carried a set of advantages the Zero could not answer. A top speed near 414 miles an hour, a ceiling above 40,000 feet, turbo superchargers that kept the engine strong at altitudes where an ordinary carburetor gasped and lost half its power, and in the nose, packed together right in front of the pilot, 1 20mm cannon and 4 heavy machine guns, all firing straight ahead in a single concentrated hammer of fire. That last point mattered more than it looked. Most fighters carried their guns spread through the wings, angled inward to converge at a single point some distance ahead. So their fire was truly concentrated only at that one range and scattered everywhere else. The Lightning's guns were bunched into the nose and fired in a parallel stream that stayed lethal from close in to well beyond the reach of the Zero's lighter weapons. A P-38 pilot could open fire before the enemy could even reach him. Add drop tanks under the wings, and the Lightning could carry that fight for hundreds of miles beyond the range of any single-engine fighter in the theater. The pilots loved other things about it too. It was solidly built and could soak up damage that would have finished a lighter aircraft. The high central cockpit gave a view all around that pilots of enclosed single-engine fighters could only envy. It had its quirks, and at the edges of its performance it could bite. But in the hands of a trained man fighting the way he had been taught, it came very close to untouchable over New Guinea. They gave it their trust, which is the highest thing airmen give a machine. 2 engines were worth more than any single-engine fighter's grace when the way home ran across hundreds of miles of jungle and shark-filled sea. Men who flew it came to believe, with good reason, that they had the best fighter in the Pacific under them, and that belief was itself a weapon. Confidence made them aggressive. Aggression flown with discipline made them deadly, but the machine was only half of the answer. The other half was a decision about how to fight, and that decision was the true heart of the whole thing. American pilots would stop trying to turn with the Zero. Full stop. They would use the Lightning's speed and power to fight in the vertical instead of the horizontal. They would climb above the enemy. They would dive on him out of a height he could not reach. They would fire in one slashing pass and use the momentum of that dive to zoom back up to altitude before he could react. Then they would do it again, strike from above, climb away, never stay to turn. It was the reverse of everything a fighter pilot had ever been taught. Against the Zero, it was murderous. The logic was simple and unforgiving. A Zero could outturn a Lightning every single time. It could not follow one down. Pushed into a high-speed dive, the light Japanese fighter shuddered and threatened to tear itself apart, while the heavier Lightning only gathered speed. A Zero could not climb after a Lightning that had traded its speed for height, and it could never catch a Lightning whose pilot simply decided to leave. The American, so long as he kept his discipline and refused the turning fight, held every card. He chose when to attack, he chose when to break off, and there was nothing the finest dogfighter in the world could do about it. Pilots came to think in terms of energy. Height was energy stored up, waiting to be spent. Speed was energy in motion. The Lightning was a machine for turning one into the other and back again. A pilot who kept his energy high always held the choice of when to fight. A pilot who bled it away chasing a zero around the sky handed that choice to the enemy and usually did not live to regret it. The hardest part was never the flying, it was the discipline, the constant refusal of the instinct to turn and chase, the patience to break off a promising attack and climb away rather than be dragged down into the fight the Zero wanted. The very qualities that made the Zero supreme in a dogfight were the ones that doomed it against these new tactics. To be so nimble, it had been built impossibly light, which meant it carried almost no armor for its pilot and no self-sealing tanks to survive a hit. A single good burst from the Lightning's concentrated nose guns could rip it open. Its own guns were light. Its airframe could not bear the stress of a fast dive. The Zero was a duelist's blade, elegant, lethal at close range, all but useless against an enemy who would never close. There was a human cost buried in that lightness. With no armor and no protection for its fuel, the Zero tended to burn when it was hit, and its pilot rarely got out. The same choices that had made the fighter so agile turned it into a death trap once an enemy could reliably bring guns to bear. Each Japanese fighter, a P-38 caught in a diving pass, was, more often than not, a trained pilot killed. And trained pilots were exactly what Japan could least afford to lose. The Japanese High Command made the danger worse by misreading it. Twin-engine aircraft, in all of their experience, were bombers or heavy escort fighters, too large for real air-to-air combat. So they filed the P-38 away as something other than a true fighter, and they built no answer to it, because they did not yet believe they needed one. By the time they finally understood, over New Guinea, that the Americans had put into the sky a fighter their Zero simply could not fight, the killing had already begun in earnest. The man who brought the Lightning to New Guinea was General George Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force. Kenny had seen a young pilot named Richard Bong back in California throwing a P-38 around the sky over San Francisco with a natural skill that bordered on reckless. He had marked the young man and taken him along to the Pacific. Bong was a farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, the son of a Swedish immigrant. One of 9 children, he had learned to fly through a civilian training program while at Teachers College, and he was gifted with the kind of eye and touch that cannot be taught. He was also, in the way of gifted young pilots, reckless. In training over California, he had looped a fighter around the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge and buzzed the streets of San Francisco. He had been grounded and dressed down for it. The general who did the dressing down was Kenny. Instead of ending the young man's career, Kenny remembered his flying. When he shipped out to take over the 5th Air Force, he took the farm boy with him. The war they flew into was going badly. Through 1942, the Japanese had pushed across New Guinea toward Port Moresby, the last real barrier between them and Australia. Allied troops were fighting a brutal, disease-ridden campaign in the mountains and swamps to throw them back. Air power was central to all of it, and for months the Japanese had held the upper hand overhead. Kenny had been sent to change that, and the Lightning was the instrument he meant to change it with. Bong had been assigned to one squadron, but flew that December with another, borrowing a cockpit while his own unit still waited for its Lightnings to arrive. The squadron he attached himself to was led by a cool, skilled Pennsylvanian named Thomas Lynch, one of the first true masters of the Lightning, and a man who would finish among the top aces of the theater before he was killed. Under leaders like Lynch, the borrowed pilots and the new machines were learning the vertical game by flying it day after day against an enemy who did not yet grasp what was happening to him. The test came on December 27, 1942, over the New Guinea coast. About a dozen P-38s of the Squadron Bong was flying with intercepted a large Japanese formation, and the fight unfolded exactly as the new doctrine had promised. Diving from above, the Americans tore through the enemy. The Japanese could neither climb to reach them, nor dive to follow them. The squadron claimed close to a dozen enemy aircraft, destroyed for the loss of a single Lightning. 2 of those kills were the first of Richard Bong's career. At Japanese Naval Air Headquarters, the reaction was disbelief hardening into a scramble to understand. Intelligence officers pulled apart everything they thought they knew about the twin-tailed aircraft and found they had badly underestimated it. They had built their whole defense around the assumption that they would face the same American fighters they had always beaten, flown in the same old way. Now they had to reckon with a machine that fought in a dimension their Zero could not enter, and they had no quick answer to hand their pilots beyond a grim instruction. Do not fight the twin-tailed aircraft on equal terms. Engage it only with the advantage of height and numbers. If the first pass fails, break off and run. The after-action reports read like confusion hardening into alarm. Pilots described an enemy that struck from impossible heights and impossible ranges, that could not be caught and could not be pinned into a fight. The comfortable world of turning combat, the world in which they had never once met a serious equal, had simply ceased to exist over New Guinea. In its place was a vertical battlefield where speed and altitude decided everything, and the tight turn was worth almost nothing. The change came quickly once it had begun. Within a few weeks, Richard Bong was an ace, and he was only the most visible of a fast-growing number of them. New squadrons arrived in theater, studied the combat reports of the men who had gone before, and drilled the same iron discipline into their pilots. Altitude is life. Speed is life. Never turn with the enemy. Hold the height. Dive, strike, and climb away. Do it again. Commanders drilled it relentlessly because the whole system depended on every pilot holding to it, even when his blood was up. A single man who forgot himself and turned to chase a Zero could die in seconds. Worse, he could pull his wingman down with him. So they trained it until it was instinct. Until the urge to climb away from a beaten enemy overrode the urge to finish him with a turn. The pilots who learned that lesson lived and scored. The ones who could not learn it tended not to last long enough to matter. The scoreboard climbed all through 1943. Bong passed 10 victories, then 15, then 20. Other names climbed with him, Lynch among them, and a growing roster of aces who had mastered the diving attack. The 5th Air Force was no longer just holding on over New Guinea. It was taking the sky away from the enemy, mission by mission, and pushing the Japanese back toward their great base at Rabaul. The proof at the strategic level came in the first days of March 1943 in the waters off New Guinea. A Japanese convoy was carrying troops to reinforce the desperate fighting around Lae, and Kenny's 5th Air Force fell on it. The Lightnings flew top cover, and when the Zero escorts climbed to defend the ships, the P-38s met them in the vertical and held them off the bombers below. The bombers, running in low over the water, sank the convoy where it steamed. 8 transports and 4 destroyers went to the bottom in what became known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned before they ever reached the fighting. The resupply of New Guinea by sea effectively ended there. The Zero had failed to protect the one thing it most needed to protect. Then, in April, American codebreakers handed the war a rare and perishable gift. They had decrypted the travel schedule of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was about to fly an inspection tour of bases in the Solomon Islands. For a few hours on April 18, 1943, the exact time and place of his aircraft would be known to his enemies. The chance was almost too good to use. Some officers worried that shooting down Yamamoto would tell the Japanese their most secret codes had been broken. A secret worth more than any single admiral. In the end, the decision went the other way. The order came down to attempt the interception, but there was a second problem, and it was one only a particular aircraft could solve. Distance. Yamamoto's route lay more than 400 miles of open water out from the American field on Guadalcanal, Only one aircraft in the theater had the range, the speed, and the navigation to even attempt it, and that was the Lightning. The mission fell to a force of 16 P-38s drawn from several squadrons, led by a gifted navigator, Major John Mitchell. Mitchell planned the flight like a mathematical problem. He worked out a dog-legged course of several separate legs that would swing wide around the islands and come up on the interception point from the seaward side, where nobody would be watching for it. He calculated headings, speeds, and timings down to the minute for a 2-hour flight over featureless ocean with no way to correct along the way. He had one chance to put 16 fighters at a single point in the sky. At the exact moment a particular aircraft passed through it, hundreds of miles from home, to slip under Japanese radar, they went the entire way at wave-top height, only a few dozen feet above the sea, in total radio silence, holding heading by dead reckoning. There were no landmarks. There was no room for error. Mitchell's navigation proved very nearly perfect. At almost the exact minute he had predicted, the Japanese aircraft appeared ahead of them. 2 bombers carrying the Admiral and his staff, screened by 6 Zero escorts. While most of the American formation climbed to hold off the escorts, a small attack element bored straight in. Lieutenant Rex Barber pressed his fire into the lead bomber and sent it down burning into the jungle. The man who had planned the strike on Pearl Harbor died in the wreckage. A second bomber carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff was hammered down into the sea. Though that officer survived, one Lightning did not come home. The exact credit for the Admiral's aircraft was argued over for decades. The modern verdict gives that kill to Barber. The Japanese never learned, while the war lasted, that their codes had betrayed them. They put the loss down to bad luck and a chance encounter, and the secret held. The myth of Japanese command of the Pacific, already cracked by Midway and Guadalcanal, took another deep and public blow. And the aircraft that had made the whole thing possible was the very same twin-tailed fighter that was emptying the sky over New Guinea. For the Japanese pilots, who had to face the Lightning day after day, the effect was corrosive in a way that went past mere losses. They had begun the war as the finest fighter pilots on Earth, sure of their skill and their machine. Now they flew against an enemy they could not reach, could not catch, and could not escape. Death came at them out of heights they could not climb to. Captured letters and post-war accounts spoke of exhaustion and dread, of men who scanned the sun above them without rest, waiting for the twin-tailed shapes to fall out of it. Japan tried to build its way out of the problem. New fighters appeared over the last 2 years of the war. Faster machines meant to climb higher, dive harder, and finally meet the Lightning on its own ground. Some of them were genuinely dangerous aircraft. They came in numbers far too small, flown too often by pilots too green to use them well. They never arrived in time. Through all of it, Richard Bong simply kept scoring. His method almost never changed. He would climb above the enemy, choose his target, dive and fire from very close range. So close that on more than one occasion he flew through the debris of the aircraft he had just destroyed. He always insisted his own marksmanship was poor and made up for it by getting near enough that he could not miss. It was a strange humility in a man doing such lethal work, and the pilots around him noticed it. He did not boast. He did not seem to hate the enemy. He went about the deadliest job in the theater with the manner of a man doing a job. In April 1944, he shot down his 26th and 27th aircraft, passing the old American record of 26 that Eddie Rickenbacker had set in the First World War. He went on flying even after that. Sent home, celebrated, sent back again. Made a gunnery instructor with orders only to defend himself and not to go looking for combat, an order he chose to read very loosely. Over the Philippines in the last months of 1944, he kept adding to his total until it stood at 40 enemy aircraft, every last one of them shot down in a P-38, a number no American had ever reached and none would ever pass. 40 is a figure that is hard to hold in the mind. It meant 40 separate times that Richard Bong had found an enemy aircraft, closed with it, and destroyed it. 40 times that he flew home when the man he fought did not. He was not alone at the top. In August 1943, the 5th Air Force had stood up the 475th Fighter Group, the first unit built entirely around the P-38. Before the war ended, that single group would hold the 3 highest-scoring American aces in the Pacific. One of them was First Lieutenant Thomas McGuire of New Jersey. Aggressive, brilliant, difficult. Everything Bong was not in temperament. Talkative and sharp-edged where Bong was quiet. Hungry for the record where Bong seemed almost indifferent to it. The two of them spent the next year and a half locked in a strange, unspoken race. 2 young Americans climbing a scoreboard the whole Pacific was watching. In December 1944, on the airfield at Tacloban in the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur pinned the Medal of Honor to Bong's chest. Throwing away his prepared remarks, MacArthur called him, in a phrase that stuck to him for good, the man who had ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines. Kenny pulled him out of the war for good soon after. Bong went home in January 1945. He married his sweetheart Marjorie, the woman whose name he had painted on the nose of his Lightning, and took a new job as a test pilot for Lockheed. On August 6, 1945, the same morning that a single bomb destroyed Hiroshima half a world away, Richard Bong took off from the Lockheed field in California in one of the new P-80 jet fighters. The engine failed just after he left the ground. He tried to bail out. He was too low for his parachute to open. America's ace of aces was killed at the age of 24 in the kind of aircraft that was about to replace the one that had made him a legend. Thomas McGuire did not live to see the war's end either. In January 1945, over the Philippines, he broke his own hardest rule. Trying to help a wingman in a low-altitude turning fight, the exact kind of fight the Lightning was never meant to accept. He hung onto his heavy drop tanks too long, stalled at low speed, and spun into the ground. He died with 38 victories, second only to Bong, killed at last by the one thing he had always warned his own pilots never to do. The great Air Force base in his home state of New Jersey carries his name to this day. He had earned the nation's highest award before he died. Over Luzon in the last days of 1944, across 2 days of savage fighting, he had shot down a string of enemy aircraft while shielding the bombers he was escorting, pressing his attacks through heavy fire. For that, he received the Medal of Honor. More than almost anything, he had wanted to pass Bong's 40 and become the ace of aces himself. He died still chasing it, 4 victories short. They were not the only ones. The commander of their group, Charles McDonald, ran up a score that made him the 3rd highest-scoring American ace of the Pacific. The 475th as a whole compiled a record that few fighter groups anywhere could rival. Stripped of its guns and fitted with cameras, a reconnaissance version of the P-38 ranged over the whole theater, flying so high and so fast it was nearly impossible to intercept, mapping the Japanese island bases so that others could hit them. In squadron after squadron, pilots the newspapers never mentioned flew the same disciplined vertical tactics and ground the enemy down. The aces were the visible edge of something much larger. There is an honest footnote that the loudest version of this story likes to leave out. The Lightning did not win the Pacific Air War by itself. Out over the ocean and the island fleets, the Navy and Marine fighters, the Corsair and the Hellcat, actually shot down more Japanese aircraft than the P-38 ever did. What the Lightning did, better than any other aircraft in the war, was rule the land-based air war over New Guinea and give America the 2 greatest aces it ever produced. The whole truth is more crowded than the legend, and it is still a triumph. Strip away the maps and the casualty counts, and the fall of the Zero comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. The enemy owned a sky of tight turns and close dogfights. The Americans simply refused to fight in it. They built a machine and a method that lifted the whole battle into the vertical, into altitude and speed and the diving pass. And up there, the Zero's genius for the turn was worth nothing at all. The men who flew the Lightning mostly did not outlive their fame. Richard Bong lies today in a small cemetery in Poplar, Wisconsin, the farm town he came from. In 2024, a search team found the wreck of his old Lightning, the Marge, in a jungle ravine in New Guinea. The red paint was still visible on the wingtips. 8 decades after the last mission it flew, the aircraft outlived the men who made it famous. The vertical combat the Lightning pioneered, the doctrine of altitude and speed over the turning fight, became the very foundation of jet-age air fighting. It is taught to the pilots who fly today. Kelly Johnson, the engineer who had drawn that odd twin-tailed shape, went on to run the secret workshop that built the spy planes of the Cold War, the U-2 and the Blackbird. Aircraft that flew higher and faster than anything before them, carrying forward the same conviction that had shaped the P-38. Reach the fight from a place the enemy cannot follow, and the fight is half won before it begins. That's the story they never quite told us right. The Lightning was not a miracle. It was a decision. Somebody decided the enemy would not be met on his own terms. Somebody built a machine that made the decision possible. And a young farm boy from Wisconsin, who probably should have been court-martialed for buzzing the Golden Gate, flew it into the record books before dying at 24 in a fighter 1 generation newer than the one he had mastered. If you'd rather have your history this way, honest about who won what and why, without the invented numbers and the wonder weapon myths, I'll keep finding these stories if you'll keep listening. I'll be back next week with another one.